In this lecture, we'll rig up an animation for when our player gets either hit by an obstacle or a fence. To set up this animation, we need to combine both using our animator and our animation windows. Let's go ahead and open up those two windows by going up to our very top toolbar, opening up Window, and finding the Animation dropdown. Let's go ahead and open both our animator and our animation windows. Let's go ahead and just dock them over here by our project and our console for now. For example, if you open up your player game object in your hierarchy at the moment, the king that we actually imported already has our run animation loaded up. If you click this king rig underneath your player game object, it already has an animator component attached to it. With this king still selected, if you open up the animator window, you can actually see all of the states that exist inside of our animator. At the moment, it just has this one run animation that immediately is entered when our game enters play mode. This one run state being this one run animation we see here. You can actually just click play here in the animation window and it will actually cycle through this entire animation and all of its keyframes. Now, I don't know if you can notice, but there's actually been something going on since the very beginning of this project that it's not that big of a deal, but it does just ever so slightly bother me. And it does actually give us a better, clear explanation of what's actually happening in our animation window. This animation was created in Blender, a 3D modeling software, and then exported into Unity, which is why you see so many keyframes. However, we can make small adjustments as needed if we need to. At the moment, this animation is using seconds at the very top of the toolbar. However, I tend to actually like to see things in each individual keyframe. So if you come to this little tiny menu at the top of your toolbar in your animation window, you can actually change this from seconds to frames. You can see that in between each individual frame, I think everything looks really smooth and comes together quite nicely. However, in between frame 13 to 14, you can see a bit of a drastic jump for my liking. So if you actually click any keyframe at the very top, it will also select all of the keyframes below it for that specific keyframe, which in this case is probably quite a few dozen or so. However, if you actually delete this keyframe entirely, the one where it's kind of making that bit of a drastic jump for my liking, it will actually just delete that keyframe and all of the keyframes below it. So let's actually just delete keyframe 13. Now, that actually doesn't affect as much as you might think because it still takes the time to transition between keyframe 12 and keyframe 14. And you can actually see here, it gives us a bit of a more natural transition in between keyframe 12 and 14. For whatever reason, it's a relatively small thing, but I do think it looks a bit more natural when we're looping through our running animation. It doesn't have quite that, just that little bit of a jarring jump in our running animation. So a bit of an optional side tangent, but I do think that smooths up our transition nicely. Now, when we run into each individual object in our scene for both our fence and our obstacles, I would like to just kind of trigger some sort of tripping animation for our king. Well, we don't actually have that animation to provide to you, but I think this is a great opportunity to go and explore how to rig up our own custom animations from different sites, things like Mixamo.com. Mixamo is an incredibly popular platform provided by Adobe that we can use in our personal and even commercial projects. It has a bunch of different FBX models that you can actually use for whatever project you'd like, as well as a bunch of different free animations that we can actually use. We can actually download whatever animation we want and put it inside of our Unity project and rig it up however we'd like. So head over to Mixamo.com. You will need to create a free account. Once you have that account created, head over to the Animations tab and just search for Stumble. I'll make sure I leave this exact link to this exact search query in the Resources tab down below. Once you're on this page and you have the jogging stumble selected, over here you can actually see a preview of what this jogging stumble is going to look like. However, we don't actually want to activate root motion, in other words, the character moving along with the actual animation itself. We just want our character to stay in place. So over here on the very bottom of the right column, you can actually just go ahead and toggle on this in place option. That way, when we actually download the FBX file with the animation inside, it won't actually move or override any sort of motion we have in our game. With in place selected, we can go ahead and ignore all of these other options for now. We can simply just click download. We can go ahead and keep all of these download default settings as is. You don't need to change anything. We could toggle on without skin instead of with skin, just so it didn't download the entire model with it. However, I actually kind of like to keep the skin so you can see the preview of what this looks like in Unity, and I'll go ahead and show you how to disassemble just the animation inside Unity. So let's just go ahead and keep with skin selected. With these default download settings, let's go ahead and click the download button. Once you have that jogging stumble FBX file downloaded in your downloads folder, you can just go ahead and drag that into your Unity scene. I'm going to do that here in my imported assets folder, third-party assets, and then I'll just drag it in here for now. I'll go ahead and create a new folder called Mixamo Animations, even though we'll just have this one animation. You can go ahead and save it wherever you'd like, but for now, I'm just going to go ahead and save it in this third-party assets folder. I'll go ahead and drag that FBX file directly here inside of this folder. If you open up this FBX model, you can see all the different skin assets. We can ignore that. What we're looking for is this animation icon here. With that selected, you can actually directly in your inspector just preview this animation that we just downloaded. We want to go ahead and select this parent most game asset. With that selected, you'll see 4 different tabs at the very top of your inspector. We want to change this animation type from generic to humanoid to properly be compatible with our king rig that we have set up. With that selected, let's go ahead and just scroll to the very bottom and click apply. Now that we've changed our rig animation type to humanoid, we actually just want this little animation asset here. So you can actually either copy paste it, or you can just hit Control D to duplicate this specific animation and kind of depack it from the rest of the asset. Now we just have the animation itself deconstructed from the entire asset from Mixamo. We can go ahead and rename this whatever we'd like. Let's just go ahead and rename it to Stumble Hit. And now that it's not attached to this specific skin model that we downloaded for Mixamo, it'll go ahead and use this default Unity rig over here. Even though it's just being rendered in pink at the moment, you can still click play and actually see what this would look like when we rig it up to a humanoid model. So let's actually go ahead and do that and see if it works. Let's head over to our animator. If you're wondering where this is actually saved as an asset in your project, you could go ahead and click this with your project open, and there you go. We can see it here directly in our GDTV Assets Animations folder. We just want to make sure that we're actually modifying this VIL_animation controller. Nice, let's toggle back over to our animator, and we can actually just drag this animation asset in. In our project, we want to drag in our assets, imported assets, third-party assets, Mixamo, and this one down here. I'll go ahead and collapse this asset entirely. I'm going to go ahead and drag in this stumble hit animation into our animator as a new animation state that we can actually control now in our animator itself. And now that we actually have this stumble hit animation inside of our animator, you can actually select once again the animation window, make sure that your king rig over in your hierarchy is selected, and you'll now have this new drop down that you can preview, not only this run animation, but also the stumble hit animation. If everything worked properly, you should be able to hit the play button directly here in the animation window and see that animation playing on our king model. The next step is to get that properly transitioning in our animator from our run animation to our stumble hit animation. You can actually set up a transition from animation to animation by right-clicking either animation and clicking Make Transition and transitioning to the other one. So we not only want to go from our run to our stumble hit animation, well, we're also going to want to go from our stumble hit animation, Make Transition, back to our run animation. You can click either of these windows here to modify the transition properties and what that would look like. Well, let's actually start with our run to our stumble hit transition. Over here in our inspector, we have some transition settings that we can take advantage of. At the very bottom of our inspector, we can actually see that transition in between our run animation to our stumble hit animation back to our running animation. If you actually click play now, you can see that entire animation smoothly blending between the two. When we hit either an obstacle or a fence, we want it to immediately trigger our stumble hit animation, which means we don't actually want an exit time. If we had any sort of exit time, maybe even something really small, it might look okay. But if you were to have a lengthy exit time of, say, something like 0.7 seconds, it's going to feel like a very large delay in between when we actually get hit by a giant boulder in our face to when we're stumbling. So I don't think that would quite make sense for what our intention is. Let's go ahead and unclick has exit time entirely, which gives us this little warning down here saying we don't have an exit time or any condition. So we need to give it some sort of condition for when it knows that it needs to go from our run animation to our stumble hit animation. Well, we can actually do that with what's referred to as a parameter. Over here, we have 2 different tabs in our animation window called layers and parameters. Let's go ahead and click the parameters tab. Here we can add that specific type of condition that we want. In this case, we want to trigger when we want to go to our stumble hit animation. So we're going to click this little plus icon drop down here and add a trigger. Let's just call this trigger hit, HIT with a capital H. This string reference will be case sensitive, so I'm going to use capital H hit. We can use this exact same string reference in our code to trigger this transition between our 2 animations. With this run to stumble hit transition selected, let's go ahead and scroll all the way down to the very bottom of our inspector where it says conditions, hit this little plus icon, and just make sure our hit trigger is the condition for transitioning in between these 2 animations. To get a better look of what this might actually look like in our game, you can actually just hit play in our game window and then manually trigger this hit condition. So while the game is playing, you can actually just hit this little circle here and manually trigger our hit condition. You can actually see the full flow of logic in between transitions back and forth in our animator window. Once again, if you hit the hit, keeping your eyes over here, you can see it hit, transition into stumble hit. As soon as stumble hit finishes, it transitions back into our run animation. Well, the transition looks nice and dandy, but we're having a little bit of an issue. You can see the more and more we go through this animation cycle, we're slowly offsetting our king's position. If you were to actually click this king that has the animator component attached to it, and then once again hit this little trigger here, actually look at some of its transform properties. It's both changing the rotation and the position of our entire king rig game object. Every single time we hit this, well, that's not exactly what we want. Well, let's go ahead and stop the play mode, head back to our project files, and click this stumble hit animation, and we can change some of our settings here in the inspector. We don't want either our root, transform, rotation, or our position on the Y or the X and the Z axis to change at all. So we actually want to toggle on, bake into pose, and all of these to disable any sort of root, motion, or rotation in the Mixamo animation that we actually downloaded. Great, let's go ahead and try that one more time in play mode, manually triggering our hit parameter to see if everything works correctly. Yeah, you know what, that doesn't actually look half bad, but for the sake of learning, you can actually scroll down and at the very bottom of your inspector, modify some of these transition properties to get the effect you're looking for. If you want, you could actually lengthen or move around this entire transition as needed. So if you were to do something like this, for example, and have a much longer transition in between changing from run to stumble and back and forth, you could do that. Now that actually looks something like this. Yeah, probably not exactly what we wanted. Let's go ahead and just change that all back to roughly where we had it before. I think something right around here, like if you were to be running and right there, just kind of hit that obstacle or that fence, I think that transition looks pretty smooth to me, which will introduce you to this lecture's challenge. Get your player hit animation looking good while manually triggering it in your animation window while you're in play mode, just like we were doing on screen. Go ahead and just play around with some different transition settings so you have a better understanding of how everything works. Pause the video now and I'll see you back here shortly. I think I'm pretty satisfied with how my transition looks at the moment. Now that we have that properly rigged up, we can actually fire this parameter through code. We'll tackle that in the next lecture. I'll see you there.